Welcome back, everybody. It's two guys in a stack of comics. My name's Mike. Along with me, as always, is Reed. And right behind me, you see the stack of comics. So we are all set for a video tonight. And I'm really excited because we're going to talk about one of my favorite superheroes. You guys know me and Reed kind of skew towards the DC side, but we have no shortage of love for our favorite Marvel characters. And tonight we're going to talk about one of my personal favorites of all time, which is Thor. Reed, how do you feel about Thor?
No, it's interesting. You and I kind of sat down. We talked about seven or eight characters that we just wanted to spotlight because we love talking about what's good in comic books. And Thor was one that was on both of our lists, which I would think probably about when I was a kid, he wouldn't have been. I wasn't a big Thor fan at all as a kid. I got to credit the movies for the first movie was, I think, the first time I'd really seen a lot of Thor content. I picked up maybe an issue or two as a kid. And the movie was like, man, this was really, really cool. Like Asgard and the presentation and all that. And then you go back and I think the coolest thing that Thor does is, man, the escapism that's in the Thor comic book is fantastic. I think that for me, as a Marvel comic book, he's the closest DC feeling character, I think, in Marvel, in my opinion,
You
in
think
that
that's why I like him so much?
it might be, and there's probably people who will disagree with me about that, but that was what I felt more is what I've always liked about the DC characters is that more just complete escapism. They're kind of just good people who are good people kind of thing, not a lot of humongous complexity to it, at the base. And I think Thor had a lot of that. I loved so many of the stories about exploring what is worthiness and why is he worthy and stuff like that. But just the deep dive into mythology and into Norse mythology and the gods and that kind of stuff. It just makes for just such fascinating reading. And I think it's one of these things again where you have to give Stan and Jack and whoever was really driving the train at Marvel. I know there's who gets what percentage of credit, but to recognize the mythology like the Norse mythology, they could so perfectly translate into superhero stories and blend it into this Marvel universe with all the various characters. And I mean, probably one of the greatest comic villains of all time in Loki. It's just really, really it's great escapism, and I think I've always liked that about the character because there's just endless story potential for Thor. You can put him on Earth, you can put him in Asgard, you can put him in space. Um, there's just so much great story that's there. I think especially those early Kirby, Stan stuff with the amazing art.
Oh,
I think that's
yeah.
probably my favorite Jack art, Kirby art is from his Thor. So I mean, I know that's kind of your main thing, but for me, that's what I've always liked about Thor is the escapism element. Probably 15, 20 years now I've been reading. I think since the movie came out, it's just been great.
What year? The movie came out in
I think it was
2012,
2011, so probably we're
2011.
coming up like 13, 14 years somewhere in there.
That was really cool. We'll talk a little bit more about the movies in a moment. But I'm kind of like the exact opposite of you when it comes to Thor, because I was a Thor fan in the early days. And then I haven't read any modern Thor comics. Our buddy George really impressed me with one of the storylines that was going on with Jane Foster wielding the hammer. And I bought that in trade paperback, probably a couple years after it came out or the year after it came out. And I did not recognize, one of my favorite Marvel characters. But
Yeah.
that does not diminish the love that I have for Thor. And I love the old stuff. Like, this is a Journey into Mystery number 89 with that
Mhm.
classic Kirby look. And look at the primary colors, the red, yellow, and blue. Um, Lately, I've been going down to my favorite comic shop and picking up old back issues with just such great dynamic Kirby art. I mean, just look at that. I mean, that
Yeah.
is classic Kirby, right? I mean, some of these covers are incredible. I can't wait to read this one. I haven't read this one before. I can't wait to read that one. And here's another one, kind of talking about the movies and
The Destroyer. Yeah, for
the
sure.
destroyer, how prevalent it was in the first movie and how closely, I mean, how iconically these characters were built, that 60 years later they're translated onto film and they're virtually the same.
Hmm.
That is amazing to me, and just goes to show you that how durable they are and how easily they stand the test of time. Some things fade, other things interest wanes, but these characters are just so darn good that they can recapture the attention of popular culture 60 years later and be just as strong. And I'm on the side of thinking that Kirby had more to do with the introduction of Norse mythology and the character Thor.
Then Stan.
I know I know that Stan probably directed the story somewhat here and there. You can't uncouple the two together because they were such a dynamic team, Kirby and Stan, and what they produced. But and who knows? But from my standpoint, as a Thor fan from the old days, I kind of just have this feeling that this is one of the ones that Jack was more prevalent in its creation, design, and execution.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the art that he does in those early ones, man, he just goes to town on so many things. I mean, the backgrounds, even the smallest detail on some of the pages that he's drawing, just it just brings a unique feel to it. And I think that really is what makes those early issues of Thor stand out so much, is just how much Kirby's pouring into every page on it. If you look at Thor going forward, I mean, I think the cool thing is as a character, he's actually had some really, really great runs. I mean, that's the cool thing for me was when I started discovering the character a bit more about, whatever, 10, 12 years ago when it was, diving in, reading some of the great Simonson stuff, and then bringing in Beta Ray Bill, and even in more recent stuff with like J. Michael Straczynski, where, you have Asgard gets brought down to like Oklahoma and they kind of have to reside on Earth for a bit. And I think that's the cool thing that you can do. And this is what Marvel, I think, has done so well with Thor is you take something familiar like Norse mythology and then you just do this Marvel twist on it. And it just works so well from the character creation, the character design, the way they integrate the human characters. I just think it's always been such a fascinating thing. It's one of those things where like, man, I really wish I had discovered this as a kid. But it is kind of cool as an adult when you find it. And you're like, I think I was what, 20, 22, I think when the first Thor movie came out. And just, man, it poured through issue after issue after issue. I think the coolest thing for Thor for me is as a character the dynamic with Loki and how that works in terms of the villain being his brother and how much endless story potential that is of, having a rivalry with him, but then forgiving him. And I just think there's always such a cool divide in that comic book of exploring Thor as a hero that makes him feel so much different than other characters. I think that's one of the cool
Yeah,
things about him compared to like an Iron Man or a Captain America is he truly has family dynamics. Not a lot of superheroes outside of the Fantastic Four have where they deal with their father or with their mom or with their brother. And I love that, obviously, that Shakespearean part of what's there, in
yeah.
the Thor movies and the comics, obviously.
You got to understand that how much fun the writers have with this because we're dealing with these omnipotent characters, right? They
Mhm.
live forever. Odin has lived for countless generations, and then he had these two sons, a stepson and a son that he both loved. And with that in the background, of course, I mean, and he's always the foil. You're like, no, Thor, don't trust Loki, don't trust him.
Yeah.
But he's his brother, and they live for eternity. So, he's gonna try and forgive him. He's always open to letting Loki back in, and that's very much in line with the classic mythology. Thor always gets duped by Loki because he is kind and forgiving. He has an open heart, the warrior that he is. But understanding his brother and him being part of his family, and understanding that the two of them aren't going anywhere. It's not
Yeah.
like like in a regular human lifespan where you might have a falling out with your brother, you might not see him again. No, that doesn't happen with Thor and Loki. They will always come back and be together, and whether
Yeah, no,
they're
it's such cool dynamics. And I think again, that's one of the cool things of Thor is like where I say it feels more like a DC character is Thor doesn't get as much character development as far as, him changing the way, say, like a Peter Parker does, where Peter Parker's 15 and then, go through these clear changes and evolutions. But I kind of like that of Thor. Again, I really enjoy characters where they change the story, not the story changes them. And I think that's the cool thing about Thor is one of those. I think he's more of an admirable character where it's like, okay, but and I think some of the great writers like Simonson and what he did on the character, like the great creatives who have been in touch with the character, exploring this, what is his worthiness and what does it mean and why is he worthy of the hammer? And I think that's been explored so well within the stories. I think the other part that's interesting, this is, I guess we can get into a little bit of a kind of evaluation of the character the early foundations of Thor, there is such especially the Stan and Jack stuff, you have a lot of that importance of Donald Blake, right? There's so much of the lame doctor and he's got the stick and he finds it in the cave and turns into Thor and all that. And that balance of he's a doctor and he's in love with Jane and all that. That has really disappeared out of modern Thor mythology, where the Donald Blake persona has, even in the film, it was reduced to like a little Easter egg sticker off of his shirt where she kind of discards it. For you as a fan, do you think the Donald Blake part being gone has hurt the character, or do you prefer it where it's just not he's just Thor and that's who he is?
It was disappointing for me. Like I said, I had not read a Thor comic in 30 years when the movie came out. I was excited to see him, like I always am with these characters when they get their own movie. It's always just amazing. It turns me into a 10-year-old all over again. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm gonna go see one of my favorite characters on the big screen. What a treat. Um, and and so yeah, I think it loses something. For me, I was a little bit disappointed that we didn't have the dual identity because it was such an important part of those early stories, how he was, he appeared mortal, and not only that, he was had a disability, but he was a physician, and he had this great love interest to help him, to tie him to Midgard or Earth, which was so important in his mission in the grand scheme of what Thor is. And so yeah, it was, to me, it took away from the character. It did. It took away from the story. I'll roll with it because now I'm get to see it on a movie. That's pretty cool. But I would like to dive back into some more modern issues. If you have some good storylines, pass them on to me. Like Walt Simonson's, I've heard is really good. I'll take a gander at those. But I think the character does lose a little something when he's just, and I misspoke earlier, omnipotent. I meant like, godlike character
Yeah.
who is eternal, rather than omniscient. And so I think that yeah, I think it misses something with him not having that mortal connection to Earth, which he is there to protect, and having a love interest that is immortal.
Yeah, I think the thing is with Thor, I do think the secret identity loses something when they take it away. I think it's interesting because there's great runs of the character where Donald Blake's not a part of it at all. But I will say those early issues really strike because of that balance. And I think that's one of the things that I do think again, why I would say I appreciate DC a little more than Marvel at times. And I look at most of the Marvel characters at like the balance of the secret identity, right? The Matt Murdock and Daredevil, and he's got to be both. The Peter Parker, he's got a Spider-Man. You go to DC where that's a huge foundation of Clark Kent and Bruce Wayne and Barry Allen and all those guys. I think having no personality, no civilian life really hurts Thor. And I think that's really hurt him in modern storytelling, where I think there's really no tether that's keeping you emotionally invested in the comic book. And I think that's where it has lacked a little bit is I think, having that, as much as, comics aim more towards men as far as the readers, obviously there's female readers, but men have traditionally been at least 75% of the comic book audience. We may not say as much that we like that element of it, but again, I think there's a little bit of a soap opera element to comic books that guys really enjoy and that love interest part and that balancing the civilian life and does he there was issues early on where it's like he's got to perform a surgery as Donald Blake but he's needed as Thor and how does he balance that and those sort of quagmires that you get into with a superhero adventure. I think just completely abandoning that in total hurts the character because like he said then he becomes this godlike being and it does make him a little too distant from
It
humanity.
is, in my opinion, it's integral to um, the connection for the character to his mission, which is Earth, and for the reader to connect with him in a more realistic way. Having this character who is a god portray this civilian mortal man on Earth really gives him, uh, a perspective that he needs in order for the reader to understand. Like he really sees Earth from Earth's eyes because he's here and he's in love with an Earth woman who is immortal, even though he's immortal. It's such rich storytelling, right?
Yeah,
It's
there's
just
so
so
much to
rich.
explore with it, and I think that I do think it's lost a little something. I think there are some great writers who can write great stories where there is no, Donald Blake persona, but I do think the comics lost a little bit since then. We talk about where he is now. I think the movies is an interesting thing because the first movie, the was it Kenneth Branagh one? Man, I love that film. I think it's one of the most underrated Marvel films across the board. Really got me into the character, to be honest. I read Avengers comics he was in, and I knew who he was, but I'd never really done a deep dive into the material. I think Thor on screen is interesting because I think I'm kind of the opposite, I think, of a lot of fans in that I really enjoyed Thor prior to Ragnarok. And I enjoyed Ragnarok, but I kind of, looking back at it now, don't really like that film. And I think everybody agrees Love and Thunder is weird. It's not a good film at all. But I think that's
Can
the
we not
weirdest
talk
thing. The
about
M
it?
Yeah,
Can
we'll
we
just
just
talk
not
about the
talk about
cinematic legacy of Thor. I think what's
it?
interesting
Without
is
Love and Thunder, please.
I think there's a lot of people who didn't like the Jane Foster relationship and the human characters in the first two films, and they wanted a little more. And I think we just saw Marvel learn all the wrong lessons out of stuff. I think Ragnarok was kind of a magical thing that worked because you had Hulk and Thor, and they really drove the character off a cliff. My biggest thing with Thor and the films that I can't stand is I feel like we got a character arc. And then they decided, let's just redo the same character arc, but discard it. So it was like, you had this first film where he's desperate to be the king. He wants it for all the wrong reasons. He learns he needs to be patient. Second movie, he actually turns it down. Third movie, he finally is responsible enough, learns he has to be the king of Asgard because Odin, passes away. And then you go to the Avengers movies, and it's like, I don't want to be a king anymore. I'm just going to turn it over to Valkyrie. And he does, and I hated what they did with his story. And like every single Thor movie kind of had this thing where like, oh, Thor needs to learn to be, that love is okay or whatever. And it's like we've seen this character arc 5 or 6 times of the character. I thought that was what was so disappointing is, man, I think across the first 4 or 5 appearances for Thor, he had one of the coolest story arcs. And then they just drove that thing off the rails, in my opinion. What did you think of the overall Thor story from the MCU?
I don't know why they went there. The first three films, I loved the first movie. I thought it was great. And I wrote with the whole thing that, we're not doing Donald Blake. Okay. And I rolled with it. But I don't know why they went the way they did. It's almost like we're we're not going to develop this character with priority in the way that we're going to develop other characters. Even though
Yeah, it
he's
kind of felt like he
massively
got left by the
successful,
wayside.
yeah, I really do. With both Thor and Hulk, I think they did that.
Yeah.
And you get the beer guzzling video game playing Thor,
Yeah.
and that was kind of like I was like, it's funny, but at the
Not,
same
not a
time, it's like,
great ending in the epic saga of 10 years culminating, and you get out of shape, beer guzzling video game playing Thor for the majority of the film. That
yeah,
was
I didn't
not the
like it. Although
conclusion you thought.
I laughed when I saw it. I have to admit, I'm going to be honest. I laughed when I
Hmm.
saw it. It was pretty funny. But in the arc of this legendary character who was so popular, you could talk about female comic aficionados. The ladies love Thor. There is no doubt about it. I mean, you could have rolled with that and done something special with it that was more interesting than Love and Thunder and had a movie for the ladies that they would have really appreciated. I mean,
Yeah,
do some. It's such a dramatic character. Same with the Hulk. Why turn him into comic relief? That
when you could
wasn't
have done
necessary.
It
Yeah,
really felt like they had planned out arcs for Captain America and Iron Man, and it was almost like these are the two main characters, and everybody else is just going to service the plot, even if it completely compromises the character.
it seemed
Um,
like that to me.
I think the thing that you look at with Thor, I think what happened with his is what happens with so many characters when an actor plays the character for too long. And this happened to a lesser extent with Iron Man too, in that the character becomes more like the actor than the actual character. Thor in his early movies is very much Thor from the comic books. And I think I loved the way they even had the in the universe characters kind of make it. There's the what's the scene in the Avengers where, Thor rolls by when Loki's talking with Thor, and he's like, Avengers or Shakespeare in the park or whatever. He's making all kinds of reference to that.
Right,
And that
right,
fits. That's how a character like Iron Man would view that world,
right.
right? As it went on, I think you saw, despite Hemsworth being a really good Thor in the first few appearances of it, and I still think he's a fantastic, casting for the role. I feel like by the end that we got to the fourth or fifth film, it was more, this is Chris Hemsworth with a hammer instead
Yeah,
of, Thor. Very
yeah,
similar to like Jason Momoa's Aquaman, where it was this is Jason Momoa with a trident wearing an Aquaman costume. It's not Aquaman from the comics.
right.
And again, they built movies that people liked. The audiences obviously responded to it, but I think that's inevitably where it kind of went under. It's interesting with Thor because he's one of the only main Avengers who seems to still be around in the MCU. I think that's the interesting part is I think Hemsworth's expressed that he does want to be in another film. I think it would be great if they could give us like an old man Logan kind of movie with Thor. Give us what the Hugh Jackman equivalent of Logan to Hemsworth. I think it'd be really cool to see him get one final kind of epic,
Yeah,
give us some sort
like
of epic war battle kind of thing with Thor. I think that'd be great.
him on the throne of Asgard or something, and some
Yeah.
cosmic battle would be good. Yeah, I don't know if they've totally destroyed him or not, but anyway, there's plenty of good
Oh, there's
Thor
so much
adventures
good
to be had.
storytelling to explore with
Yeah,
Thor.
you're talking about like the
And
first
so
20
many
years of
characters they
Thor.
really haven't gone into either. I mean, I think that's the thing that happened with the films is eventually, the Warriors 3, the first couple movies, they had a couple cool things. They just discarded them so callously in those movies, like they were just throwaway, stormtroopers basically to die really easily. You kind of had where Sif, that dynamic completely went away. They never introduced Balder. We didn't
Yeah,
get anything with really so many characters. Beta Ray Bill doesn't get introduced. I mean, just so much that just got left by the wayside. I think that's the cool thing with Thor is despite being on screen for so much, we still have so much of that story that's never been touched. That they could absolutely explore. And even a character who's, theoretically dead like Loki. I know they did the TV show, but Loki's all about dying and coming back and stuff like that. So I think eventually, hopefully, we can get that.
he always
Last
comes
thing,
back.
we'll
Loki
kind of
does.
close with where he is currently in comic books. And I think to me, what's interesting is I think Thor has kind of suffered the most of Marvel characters lately. I think him and Captain America have been the two that I don't know what it is with creatives lately, but it almost seems like they write these characters and they hire people who don't really like the character. And I know there are people who are fans of the Jason Aaron run on Thor, but to me, I don't that entire run, I mean, the Gore of the God Butcher story was great, but then when you put in what they did with the Jane Foster thing, and basically the comic becomes, man, Jane is just greater at being Thor than Thor could be. I mean, like every story was essentially, look how amazing Jane is, and Thor's this depressed drunk who, doesn't know how to do without his hammer. I just thought it was such poor writing for that. And then they did the whole he became unworthy. Oh, we'll tell you about it 7 years from now if you keep buying the issues. And they never really gave us a satisfactory explanation. I look at what they're doing now. I mean, I guess he's king of Asgard now, which is kind of cool because they had, Odin passed in the comic books. But even the modern runs, it just kind of seems like he's a character, like you said, without a rudder. It's a ship without a rudder kind of thing. And I do think, I think if they would bring back the Donald Blake persona, I think that would really rejuvenate the comics, give it just
It
a different, fresh kind of angle.
just takes one good writer to reset it all, you know,
Yep.
to get somebody who really cares and then give them a good, couple years of the run and they'll bring him back. He's not going anywhere. He's one of those iconic characters like Superman and Batman and Spider-Man. You can mess him up, but eventually there'll
You
be a
just get
writer.
one good story and it brings it
There'll
back
be
on
a
board.
writer that comes along and reminds us all why we love
Not
that
that
book.
I will say this hoping it doesn't happen, but also kind of that it does. I don't want Rob de la Torre to leave Conan, but
I
man,
know.
Rob de la Torre
Well,
on a
he would.
Conan book or on a Thor book, sorry, the Conan
Yeah.
guy, Rob de la Torre on a Thor book would be amazing storytelling wise. I think if you could get that. But
Yeah.
let us know what you guys think below. We just thought we'd talk a little bit about Thor, one of the best characters in Marvel's mythology, some of the things we think about the character that makes him great. Let us know what you guys think. Do you like Thor? Are you a Thor fan? What's your favorite Thor storyline? And what do you think about where the character is currently? If you were put in charge of Marvel, what would you do to try to rejuvenate the character a bit? And that he does seem not in the worst place, but I think he's fallen a little bit on harder times in terms of his current reputation in comics. As always, folks, let us know what you think. God bless you. We'll catch you in the next video.
Thanks, everybody.